I'll tell you why X prioritizes foundation over flash. Because I've lived through the consequences of getting that order wrong. And when you build things that matter at planetary scale, you learn pretty fast that optics without substance collapse under pressure. And I didn't come from a world where things were handed to me or polished for presentation. I grew up watching systems fail and succeed based on whether the underlying physics made sense, and that mindset never leaves you. So when people ask why X doesn't chase every shiny feature or redesign itself every 5 minutes, it's because I've seen what happens when you decorate a house before you pour the concrete. The walls crack, the roof leaks, and eventually everyone blames the house, when the real problem was the foundation, and X is not a toy. It's a global nervous system. It's where information propagates faster than any other medium humanity has built. And if the core systems aren't resilient, if the infrastructure isn't lean, if the code isn't understandable and fixable, then no amount of visual polish will save it when traffic spikes or adversaries attack or incentives distort behavior. And I've spent decades building rockets, cars, batteries, and factories, and none of those work. If you focus on what looks good before what works, a rocket doesn't care how inspiring the paint job is if the engine fails. And a platform that carries speech doesn't care how trendy the interface is if it can't deliver truth quickly and reliably. So, when we talk about prioritizing foundation at X, we're talking about reducing latency, hardening security, rebuilding systems that were fragile and overcomplicated, aligning incentives so creators are rewarded without corrupting discourse, and stripping away layers that existed only because nobody wanted to touch them before. And that's uncomfortable work. It doesn't demo well, it doesn't trend, and it doesn't give you instant applause. But it's the only way to create something that lasts, and I've learned that long-term trust beats short-term hype. Every single time people may complain that something feels unfinished while the plumbing is being replaced, but once the pipes stop bursting, the value becomes obvious. And I'm not interested in building a company that peaks on launch day. I'm interested in building infrastructure that's still relevant decades from now, and Flash is easy. You can buy it, you can fake it, you can ship it in a sprint. But foundation requires conviction, because you're investing in things most users will never consciously notice until they're gone, like uptime, fairness, scalability, and freedom from manipulation. And X exists to support civilization scale conversation, not to win a design award, and if that means enduring criticism while we rebuild the core, then that's a trade I'll make every time. Because the future doesn't reward the loudest polish. It rewards the systems that keep working when everything else breaks. And that's the philosophy behind X. And honestly, it's the same philosophy behind everything I've ever tried to build. And part 2 of this story is about pressure, because once you decide to rebuild the foundation, everyone suddenly becomes an architect, and they all have opinions. And most of them are optimized for how things feel right now, not how they survive tomorrow. And I've learned that leadership isn't about reacting to noise. It's about listening to signal, and signal usually whispers while noise screams. So at X, we made decisions that looked irrational to people who only saw the surface because they didn't see the load the system was carrying, or the technical debt accumulating underneath. And I've seen this movie before at Tesla, when we tore apart production lines that technically worked but couldn't scale. And at SpaceX, when we blew up rockets on purpose because the data mattered more than the optics. And the same logic applies here, because a platform that influences elections, markets, wars, and culture cannot be built on brittle assumptions or legacy rules that no longer match reality. And when you inherit a system that's grown fat and slow, the first responsibility is to make it honest again. Honest code, honest metrics, honest incentives. And that means removing things that exist only to signal virtue or comfort. Advertisers at the expense of users and people. Confuse discomfort with failure. But discomfort is often just growth happening faster than expectations can adjust. And the truth is, most great systems look worse before they look better when you're rebuilding the core, because you're exposing problems that were previously hidden under layers of polish and automation. And I'd rather confront reality directly than maintain an illusion of stability. And the other reason foundation matters more than Flash is because Flash creates fragility. It locks you into decisions that are hard to undo, while foundation gives you optionality. And optionality is everything in a world that changes as fast as this one. Because once the core is strong, you can move faster than anyone else, you can experiment safely, you can add features without breaking everything, and you can adapt to new threats, whether they're technical, political, or cultural. And that's why we focus obsessively on first principles, asking what this platform actually needs to function at maximum truth, velocity, with minimal distortion and minimal centralized control. And that's not something you solve with branding or UI tweaks. It's something you solve by rethinking ranking systems, moderation tools, monetization models, and open access from the ground up. And yes, it's messy, and yes, it invites criticism, but the alternative is slow decay, wrapped in nice graphics, and I refuse to preside over decline. And the final piece people miss is that users are smarter than they're given credit for. They can feel when something is real, even if they can't articulate it, and over time, they reward systems that respect them, not systems that try to distract them. And if we do this right, the foundation becomes invisible because it just works. And when it just works, the flash becomes optional, not necessary. And that's the point. Build something so solid that you don't need to sell it with tricks, because the value speaks for itself. And that's the long game at X. And the long game is the only game I know how to play. It gets philosophical because once the foundation is stable, you start asking why you're building at all. And that's something I think most companies never really confront. They optimize for engagement charts or quarterly numbers without asking whether the system they're feeding is actually making the future better. And when you zoom out far enough, you realize that platforms shape behavior, and behavior shapes civilization. And if you get that wrong at scale, you don't just fail as a company, you fail as a steward of technology. And I take that personally because technology is a force multiplier. It amplifies intent. And if the underlying architecture rewards outrage, dishonesty, or herd behavior, then you're not hosting conversation, you're warping it. And the reason foundation matters so much at X is because values get encoded into systems whether you intend them to or not. And if you don't consciously design for robustness, fairness, and openness, you end up with something that looks neutral but quietly biases everything downstream. And I've seen how small incentives create massive second-order effects, how a tweak in ranking can change what millions of people believe is important or true. And that's not something you solve with a coat of paint or a clever marketing campaign. That's something you solve by slowing down, thinking deeply, and sometimes making unpopular calls because the math says it's right, even if the crowd says it's wrong. And I've learned that if you want to do something genuinely new, you have to accept being misunderstood for a long time, because novelty looks like chaos until the pattern emerges. And rebuilding X has been about clearing space for that pattern to emerge, removing constraints that no longer served their original purpose, and trusting that if you align the system with reality, reality eventually wins. And people think this is about control, but it's actually about relinquishing control, building a platform that doesn't need constant intervention because it's structurally sound and self-correcting. And that's harder than micromanaging outcomes because it requires humility, it requires admitting you don't have all the answers and designing something that can evolve without you. And the irony is that once you get the foundation right, the creativity explodes because you're no longer fighting fires, you're exploring possibilities, and that's when the real innovation happens, not when you're chasing trends, but when you've built something strong enough to support experimentation without collapsing. And that's where X is headed, not as a finished product, but as an evolving system grounded in first principles and resilience. And if that takes time, if it looks rough along the way, that's fine, because I'm not building for headlines. I'm building for history. And history doesn't remember who looked best in the middle of the process. It remembers what actually worked when it mattered most.